Welcome once again to our discussion on principles of economics. And today we will talk about production and growth. If you look at countries across the globe, you see there is a huge variation in their standard of living, right? Some countries they have a very high standard of living, while in others you see the standard of living is very poor. To make you understand about the variation in standard of living, first you look at this particular picture, which is a typical family picture taken from the UK. Now, what do you understand from this picture? This is representing the standard of living. Look at their houses, look at the items they have in their possession, and look at the food items they are eating. You can easily understand their standard of living. Now, this kind of standard of living, as you can understand, that standard of living for a single individual and standard of living for the country as a whole, it depends on what? It depends on your income, right? So, this particular country UK, which is one of the advanced economies, they have a high standard of living, which is very clear from this picture, is because of their high per capita income. What is their per capita income? Look at, in 2021 they have GDP per capita of $46,510. You can easily understand the value if you compare this GDP per capita with India's GDP per capita, which is merely around some $2,500. Okay. So, because of this high per capita, their life expectancy and adult literacy is also very high. Now, look at another picture. This picture is taken from a family from Mexico, which is supposed to be a middle income country. If you compare this picture with the earlier one, you can easily understand the difference. They also have sufficiently good amount of goods and services to enjoy, but if you compare this with the UK, you can easily make the difference. And this country's per capita income is $11,410 in the year 2021. Life expectancy is little lower, adult literacy is also lower compared to the UK, and it is because of the difference in their income, per capita income. Now, I will show you another country. Look at this country. This is a country called Mali from one of the sub-Saharan Africa. Look at this. These countries literally have nothing apart from couple of sticks. Look at their housing. Look at the food items what they are eating. They are all suffering from malnutrition, because you see their per capita income, it is only $873. Okay, that is their income. So, at the one hand we have countries like UK where the income is around $46,000 per capita, and this is only 873. So, obviously it makes no difficulty to understand there is a huge variation across countries, and it is due to their variation in per capita income. So, if you look at the income growth around the world, there are countries like China, Singapore, Japan, where the growth was huge in the period 1960 to 2005, whereas countries like United States, Colombia, Canada, New Zealand, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, their growth rate was not that high. Here we are talking about growth rate. Even though their per capita income is quite high, the growth rate is not that great. So, there are vast differences in living standard around the world, and that you can understand from the GDP per capita in 2005, huge variation. And then there is also great variation in growth rate across the countries. That is what we can understand from this data. Now, income and growth around the world, if you see, since growth rates vary, the country rankings can also change. Poor countries are not necessarily doomed into forever poverty. A country is poor today, that does not mean the country will remain poor forever. For example, the country like Singapore, it was quite poor. Income was very low in 1960, but in today Singapore is one of the most richest countries in the world. Similarly, the rich countries cannot also maintain their status quo forever. The country which is rich today may not be so rich tomorrow, because poorer countries may catch up. That happens. Okay, that happens. So these are the then important questions. Why are some countries richer than the others? Why do some countries grow quickly while others stuck in poverty trap? And what public policies may actually help raise growth rates and long term living standard? These are the important questions that we need to understand. So, if you recall, in one of our 10 principles, we said that standard of living depends on productivity. Since resources are given, how much output each labor, if we consider labor is the single most factor of production, how much output an average labor can produce, that is actually productivity, and that in turn determines the income. If you compare the productivity of labor across the globe, you see the productivity is much higher in countries like UK, US, France, Canada, Japan compared to other countries, and that differences in productivity can easily explain the differences in per capita income and thereby standard of living. So, let us now try to understand then what makes productivity to differ across the globe. Okay, this was the principle. Let us say that Y means the real GDP, the amount of output that a country can produce, and L is the quantity of labor employed. Then Y by L, that gives average productivity of a labor. And why productivity is so important? Because when a nation's workers are very productive, then real GDP is very large. When productivity grows rapidly, living standard also grows. Then the question is, what determines productivity and its growth rate? That is very important. If productivity is so important in determining growth and income and living standard, so we must focus on then factors that actually determine productivity. So, first factor that helps productivity to grow, or determinants of productivity, is capital per worker. So, the stock of machinery, equipment or structure that is used for production is called physical capital, denoted by K, and K by L actually capital per worker. So, productivity is obviously higher when the worker gets more machines, more capital, because to produce something, laborers they need equipment, machinery, so on and so forth. With empty hand, we cannot produce much. So, your productivity is enhanced when you are allotted with some amount of capital in terms of equipment, machinery, okay, so on and so forth. So, capital per unit of labor causes output per unit of labor to improve. That is why we say that K by L, which is capital per unit of labor, is a single most determinant of Y by L, which is productivity. Second is human capital per worker. Human capital is basically the knowledge or the skill that is endowed in the labor. Okay? Without knowledge or skill, we cannot produce anything. So, the physical man, the human being, is actually not the human capital, rather the knowledge or skill that is endowed in that labor, that is human capital, which comes through proper education or proper training. So, human capital is the knowledge and skill workers acquire through education, training and experience. So, H is the human capital and H by L is the average workers human capital. So, productivity is higher when average worker has more human capital. So, that means again I can say that H by L is also a determinant of Y by L. Then natural resources per worker, it is called natural capital. So, natural resources mean the inputs that comes from the nature or the environment, like mineral, land, okay, so on and so forth, renewable and non-renewable resources that comes from the nature is called natural capital. So, an increase in N by L causes an increase in Y by L. So, if you look at across the globe, some countries are very rich in natural capital, like you can take the Saudi Arabia, it is rich with oil. Many of the African countries also, they have a huge deposit of many minerals, but there are countries which are rich, but they do not have that much natural resources, like Japan. They can import these natural resources from other countries. Then technological knowledge, society's understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services. Okay. So, technological progress does not always mean a faster computer or higher definition TV or small cell phone. Rather, it can also mean some idea, like if you go back and read the Ford company's history, the car manufacturer Ford. So, simple idea what Ford was doing when laborers are there. So, instead of asking the laborers to come back and forth to assemble the different parts of the car, rather what they did, they pushed the assembly line towards the worker. So, I am standing here, I will do my job, then that same assembly line will go to the next person, he or she will do the job, like that. So, when assembly line is moving towards the laborer, that itself increased productivity, otherwise the laborer have to come back and forth. So, technological knowledge and human capital, they are almost similar, but not exactly the same. Technological knowledge is actually the end result which comes through human capital, because human capital is the education, training, so on and so forth. So, when you are trained, when you are educated, then technological knowledge will come. Refers to society's understanding, and human capital refers to the effort people expend to acquire this knowledge through training and through education. Both are important for productivity. So, now if you look at the production function, you might have come across the mathematical function in your class 2. We used to write y equals to fx, where y is a function of x. Here y is a function, y is output, which is a function of labor, capital, human capital and natural capital. So, k indicates physical capital, and what is f there? So AF is basically the art of converting input into output. Please remember, the function has a very specific intuition in economics, very specific interpretation or meaning. Y equals to fx means this f is a rule or a mapping, or in economics we say that rule or mapping is actually an art of converting input into output. What is that art? Can you think of? What is that rule or what is that mapping that maps input into output? Who maps input into output? It is basically the technology. So, in y equals to fx, f is the technology. Then what is a there? A is basically the level of technology. Okay? Since a is appearing in a multiplicative form, higher the level of technology, higher would be your level of output given the same level of input. So, advanced countries like Japan is getting more output from a given input bundle because the A is different, level of technology. Okay, level of technology. Technology, the nature of technology might be the same, but the level at which it is, the generic technology might be the same, the art might be the same, but the level is different, advanced vis-a-vis the primitive one. That makes output difference. So, A multiplies the function f. So, improvement in technology increases, that means in A, and allow more output to be produced from the given input bundle. So, if you assume y equals to a function LKHN, then the production function has a property of constant returns to scale. What does it mean? It basically means if I change all the inputs, please remember, when I am using the word scale, it means changing all the inputs together by some percentage. Let us say that I am changing all my inputs by 5%. Then constant returns to scale means my output will also change by 5%. If it changes by more than 5%, then we will say that production function exhibits increasing returns to scale, and if it changes less than 5%, then we will say that production function exhibits diminishing or decreasing returns to scale. So, scale means entire scale of production is changing. That is why a scale change means changing all the inputs, not in specific input. If the change happens in a specific input, let us say labor is changing, but not all other factors are changing, that is called returns to factor. So, returns to factor is basically a short term phenomenon, okay? Because in the short run you may not be able to change all the factors. For changing capital, that means changes in plant and machinery, it is not possible to change plant and machinery overnight, you have to wait. So, that is why constant returns to scale is a long term phenomena, while returns to factor is short term. Okay, so, if you double all the inputs, then your output will also gets double. So, look at here, I have just multiplied all the inputs by 2. So, my output is also getting multiplied by 2, that means doubling all the inputs is giving you double the output. If you increase all the inputs 10%, then output is also changing by 10%. That is why it is called constant returns to scale. Look at, okay, 10% means 1.1, all right. Now, if we multiply each of the input by 1 by L, then what will happen? Obviously, output is also multiplied by 1 by L. Now, if we do so, look at this interesting thing. y by L equals to a function 1 k by L h by L n by L. That actually explains interesting things. So, productivity y by L then depends on the level of technology A, physical capital per worker k by L, human capital per worker h by L, and natural resources per worker n by L, provided the production function exhibits constant returns to scale. Okay. So, I will just quickly go to this slide. So, economic growth and public policy. So, first we understood what are the factors that actually determines productivity. Then we need to have proper public policy to change those determinants. For example, capital per unit of labor, physical capital, human capital per unit of labor, natural capital per unit of labor. How to increase all those factors by proper public policy, so that we can have higher productivity and higher living standard. So, how do you increase your capital per unit of labor? See, capital means if you want to buy machine or plants, it requires money. So, that means how will you get money? The capital accumulation happens through investment. If I invest, or if I save money, then the firm can borrow from the banks or other financial institution, and they can invest in their projects. So, but whatever ways you think of, without investment, capital accumulation is not possible. Okay. Since resources are scarce, so producing more capital means producing fewer consumption goods. If you want to produce more capital goods, obviously less of consumption goods. More machines means less of idli, dosa, samosas and other things. So, that means fewer consumption means you have to reduce your consumption, and if you reduce your consumption, what will happen? Your saving will increase, and that extra saving, when I save money, what I will do? Either I will keep it in bank, or I will invest directly in some stock market and share market, and that is the source of firm's capital. If you look at the circular flow of economy, which we discussed in the very beginning, the saving that comes from household sector, that goes as a loanable fund to the firm sector. Hence, there is a trade-off between the current and future consumption. So, this shows the diminishing returns and catch-up effect. The government can implement policies that raise saving and investment, then capital will rise, causing productivity and living standard to rise, but this growth is actually temporary due to diminishing returns to scale. As capital accumulation goes higher and higher, you will get lower and lower return for every unit of capital that you built in, because of the diminishing marginal return. That also we have discussed in the context of production function. So, look at this simple diagram to understand diminishing marginal return. In the y axis, I am measuring productivity, in the x axis capital per unit of labor. Look at the nature of this production function itself. Initially, when you are at a lower level of capital, if you increase, look at the growth. A small increase in capital per unit of labor is giving a higher growth in y by L. when you are at a lower level of capital stock. However, if you are a sufficiently larger amount of capital stock, what is happening? Look at this. Capital by labor has increased that much, growth in productivity is not significant. That is what I wanted to mean. So, that means if a country is here, next diagram if you go, suppose a country is poor, starts here with a lower level of capital stock. The moment you increase, and this is a rich country with a sufficiently large amount of capital stock. Now, look what is happening. When you give some amount of capital to this poor country, the growth in poor country would be huge compared to this country's growth. So, if this rate of growth happens, that ensures that this poor country will catch up with the richer country at some point of time because of this diminishing return. That is why we said that poorer countries will not remain poor forever, and rich countries will also not be able to maintain its status quo forever. These are some examples. Over the period 1960 to 1990, two countries, the US and South Korea, they devoted similar share of GDP to investment. So, same percentage of GDP for investment. So, what do you expect? You expect the similar growth performance for the US and Korea, but when you compare the growth rate, South Korea's growth rate was more than 6%, while the US grew only by 2%. Why this is so? Because to start with, South Korea's capital stock was much lower, capital per unit of labor was much lower compared to the US, and that is why the catch up. Now, investment from abroad. See, we say that capital is required for our growth, but sometimes the countries may not have enough capital in their own domestic territory. So, what they need, investment coming from abroad, and we are all aware of the word or concept called, you might have heard about this word called foreign direct investment. What is that? Foreign direct investment means capital is flowing from abroad, capital is coming from foreign countries to the home countries, and this can happen in two different ways. In foreign direct investment, the foreign companies, they invest directly or set up their own plant and machinery and operate in another country. But in foreign portfolio investment, what happens? Capital investment happens, but instead of setting their own plant, what they do, they basically invest in the stocks of some domestically owned companies. So, this foreign portfolio investment could be volatile in nature, because if it is only investment in stocks of certain companies, then they can anytime withdraw and sell that stocks and take their return back. But if it is foreign direct investment through building their own plants and machineries, then it will be difficult for them to go back immediately. Anyway, through this foreign direct investment, the fund comes from abroad. Some part of the return from this investment goes out, some part remains here. So, technological know-how, technological ideas come through this foreign direct investment also. So, this is especially beneficial in poor countries that cannot generate enough saving to fund their investment. Okay. And as I said, through this technology transfer, what happens through FDI, poor countries they get to know, they learn the state of the art technologies that is developed in other countries, because knowledge is public good, knowledge is very easy to share. So, education is also another factor that improves productivity. So, government actually can increase productivity by promoting education, investment in human capital, public school, subsidized loan for college. Okay. So, in the context of the US, education has a significant impact. So, each additional years of schooling raises the workers' wage by 10%, because the laborers become more skillful. Okay. But country has to face a trade-off. More investment in human capital means you have less available to present, because human capital will give you a return in future. There is no immediate return. So, spending a year in school requires sacrificing a year's wage now. So, there is a trade-off. Higher spending in human capital means availability of fund lower at the present time. Health and nutrition, another factor. Healthcare expenditure is a type of investment in human capital only. Why? Because even if you have so much knowledge, even if you have so much skill, if your health does not permit you to work, your productivity will be very low. So, healthier population are more productive. So, in countries with significant malnourishment, raising workers' calorific intake raises productivity. So, what is observed between 1962 to 95, calorie consumption rose 44% in South Korea, okay, 44% growth, and thereby the economic growth was spectacular in South Korea. This is because of this calorie consumption. So, the moment your calorie consumption increases, so population will become healthier. Nobel winner Robert Fogel, he showed that 30% of Great Britain's growth between 1790 to 1980 was due to improved nutrition. Nutrition is very important. So, public policies should be directed to improve the health and nutrition of the population, right? Then property rights and political stability are also important for productivity and growth. See, look at, markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity, and price system allocates the resources efficiently. But in this scenario, what is the assumption? The assumption is that property right is well defined. Unless property right is defined well, then there is always a fear that somebody will illegally encroach my property. So, I have no intention to maintain the quality of it. So, that is why property rights should be well defined. And how to ensure property right? By law and order. Law and order should be well implemented to ensure well defined property right. Okay. So, in many poorer countries, this law and order is not enforced properly. So, contracts are not always enforced. That is why we see fraud, corruption often go unpunished. Okay. In some countries, firms, they must bribe government official to get permits. If this is the case, your productivity will go down. Okay. Your productivity will go down. Similarly, the political instability also creates some kind of tension, uncertainty whether property rights will be protected in the future or not. That is why when countries suffer from, when people fear that their capital might be stolen by criminals, okay, there is less investment. including investment from abroad. No one wants to invest in countries with lower political stability. Okay. So, economic stability, efficiency, healthy growth, these are all required law enforcement, effective courts, stable constitution and honest government officials. That is why if you compare these things in a developed countries vis-a-vis in developing countries, you see that this type of scams, frauds, corruption are much lower in countries like UK, the US, Canada, Japan, whereas these are very much prevalent in countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, India and then sub-Saharan African countries. So, property right and political stability create some kind of healthy economic environment in which investment happens, capital accumulation happens, people get motivation to work, productivity get increased and thereby standard of living. Now, free trade is another channel by which a country can grow. If you recall one of our 10 principles, that trade makes everyone better off. That means through free trade, what happens is country they specialize in producing those goods and services in which they have comparative advantage or expertise. Therefore, from the same input bundle, country would be able to produce more and consume more if they are engaged in free trade. That is why trade makes everyone better off, we studied earlier, and that is why free trade is one channel by which a country can grow, by which your standard of living will increase. Okay. Through free trade you get many imported items, and in our previous lecture what we said, that when you have many items to select from, the value of your dollar increases. That is why cost of living goes down, standard of living increases. Now, free trade is of two types, inward oriented and outward oriented. Inward oriented policies means government will impose tariff, they will limit on investment from abroad. So, aim to raise living standard by avoiding interaction with other countries. So, you might have heard about Atmanirbhar policies. So, what is the broader objective of these government policies? Make in India, because we want to reduce the dependence on others. If you can reduce dependence on others, then your import bill will go down. If you produce all the items in your country, then what will happen? That means you will create more employment, more opportunities for your domestic people. That is how you can grow. But there are some challenges in inward oriented policies. When you try to produce everything on your own, that means what? You are not taking advantage from the comparative advantage concept we studied earlier. You are not specializing in the production of those goods and services in which you have expertise. Rather, you are trying to produce each and everything. So, outward oriented policies basically mean the elimination of restrictions on trade or foreign investment. So, promote more interaction with the world economy. So, this is how free trade can also impact your productivity and thereby growth and standard of living. So, trade has a similar effect as discovering new technologies. Either you discover new technology on your own, or when you engage in trade, basically technology also flows from one country to another. And in the history we saw that countries with inward oriented policies like Argentina during 20th century, they suffered. Countries with outward oriented policies, they have succeeded, like Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan after 1960s. Research and development, that means R&D, that also a channel by which a country will grow, country's productivity will increase. So technological progress is the main reason why living standard rise in the long run, because knowledge is a public good, ideas can be shared freely. Okay, so when the ideas get shared, productivity also increases. So policies, public policies are required to promote this. First of all, a significant amount of our GDP must be spent on research and development in private sector, in universities, so on and so forth. That is why if you compare the percentage of GDP spent in R&D in developed countries compared to that in developing countries, then you can see a huge difference. Government sometimes gives patent laws. Why this is important? Because R&D requires huge investment. Now immediately if people start imitating, then the countries or the companies won't be able to take benefit from the entire investment which they made. That is why patent laws are required. Okay, so government give grants for basic research at universities to promote research and development, to generate new knowledge, to come up with, to invent new technologies that will enhance the productivity and standard of living. Now here comes population growth. Now population growth can be impacting positively as well as negatively to the country's economic growth. Now 200 years back, what Malthus said, that if you have more population, then so many large number of population is sharing the same amount of resources, a limited amount of resources. So the resource, natural resource gets stretched out among many such millions of population. Okay, so what will happen? Your standard of living will definitely fall, because natural resource which is limited is divided among many, productivity will go down. Okay, but Malthus did not account for some of the potential that may come, positive impacts that may come from population growth. See, more population means also more scientists. So this is all negative impacts, diluting capital stock. So capital by labor will fall, H by K will also fall. Okay, so more population means more people for schooling. You have limited number of school, colleges and universities. So education system you also will get stretched out. So countries with fast population growth tend to have lower educational attainment. These are all shortcomings of huge population growth mentioned by Malthus. But to combat with this, so countries may take policies like China took one child per family, contraception, education and availability, promote female literacy, because if females are literate, they will participate in the job market, and that will raise the opportunity cost of having babies. Okay, when you have a kid, you have an opportunity cost because you are losing the salary, otherwise you would have participated in the labor market. So public policies sometimes can restrict the number of population through these policies so as to achieve growth. But population growth also have positive impacts by promoting technological progress. How? More people means more scientists, more inventors, more engineers, more frequent discoveries and faster technological progress and economic growth. Michael Kramer, basically he mentioned that over the course of human history, growth rate increased as the world population increased. There is a positive association between population growth and economic growth. So that means population growth is not always bad. More populated region grew faster than less populated ones. But of course, there is a challenge that if you have more population, you have to train them, you have to educate them, then only they will become scientists. If you cannot educate them, they will become criminal. So it is a challenge for the country to take the double dividend, which the economists call, when you have a huge population that can give double dividend. Okay? So you have a young population to work, you have less money spent for pensions, more population to work. But the question is whether we would be able to educate them and train them properly. That's a bigger question. That requires proper public policy. Okay. So this is some of the concept. I will not do this. So then the question is whether natural resources are really a limit to growth. What Malthus said, if you have a huge population growth, that means you are sharing the limited amount of natural resources. So that means natural resource acts as a limit to growth. But is it really a limit? That is what we are discussing. Some argue that population growth is actually depleting the Earth's non-renewable resources and thus will limit growth and living standard. But when technological progress happens, what will happen? That with the advancement in technology, we will require less natural resources. For example, today we are talking about electric car, hybrid car, that will use less gas, less oil, because it is electricity driven. Better insulation of home reduces energy required to heat or make them cooler. So that is why as resource becomes scarcer, its market price will rise and that will give incentive to preserve them. People will come up with new invention, new technologies, and that may reduce our dependence on natural resource. So natural resource, even though it is a limit to growth to some extent, we can overcome that limit and still grow if technological advancement happens. That is the point. So then in conclusion we say, in the long run, living standards are determined by basically productivity. Productivity depends on man-made capital, physical capital and human capital. So public policies are basically required to increase man-made capital, human capital and natural capital. Okay? So policies that affect determinants of productivity will therefore affect the next generation living standard. If we consume everything today, then there would be less available for our next generation. That is why we are talking about sustainable growth. Okay? So we should grow not at the cost of our future generation. We should make sure that enough resources are available for our future generation also to satisfy their own need. How will you do that? Through proper public policies. We need to get maximum output out of the given amount of input. How will that happen? Through technological advancement, through raising productivity. How will that happen? Through public policies. So one of these determinants is basically saving and investment, as we have discussed, because saving and investment will only help capital formation. Okay. Now in our next chapter, then we will discuss about how saving and investments are actually determinant in economy and how public policies may affect the rate of saving and investment also. With this, we are closing our discussion today. Thank you.